We have already discussed the passive transport of molecules and nutrients across the cell membrane. Now we will talk about the active transport. Active transport is the movement of substances against the chemical or electrical or electrochemical gradient. It is like swimming against the water tide in a river. It is also called uphill transport. This type of transport of a substance, from low concentration to that high concentration, requires energy, which is obtained mainly by the breakdown of high-energy compounds like adenosine triphosphate. Active transport of substances occurs by means of carrier proteins. Let's talk about the carrier proteins involved in active transport. They are of two types: uniport, synport, or antiport. 1. Uniport. Carrier protein that carries only one substance in a single direction is called uniport. It is also known as uniport pump. 2. Synport or antiport. Synport or antiport is the carrier protein that transports two substances at a time. Carrier protein that transports two different substances in the same direction is called synport or synport pump. Carrier protein that transports two different substances in opposite directions is called antiport or antiport pump. An example of antiport is the sodium-potassium pump. So far, we have learned that active transport requires both ATP and carrier proteins. If we look at the mechanism of active transport a little closely, when a substance to be transported across the cell membrane comes near the cell, it combines with the carrier protein of the cell membrane and forms a substance-protein complex. This complex moves towards the inner surface of the cell membrane. Now, the substance is released from the carrier proteins. The same carrier protein moves back to the outer surface of the cell membrane to transport another molecule of the substance. Much like a button that gets pushed and then reverts to its original position after some time. A question may have crossed your mind. Isn't the active and facilitated diffusion the same type of mechanisms? The simple answer is no, it is not. They are different from one another. The active transport mechanism is different from facilitated diffusion by two ways. Carrier protein of active transport needs energy, whereas the carrier protein of facilitated diffusion does not need energy. And, in active transport, the substances are transported against the concentration or electrical or electrochemical gradient. In facilitated diffusion, the substances are transported along the concentration or electrical or electrochemical gradient. Before talking about what are the types of active transport, first, let's go through the substances that are transported by active transport. The substances which are transported actively are in ionic form and non-ionic form. Substances in the ionic form are sodium, potassium, calcium, hydrogen, chloride, and iodide. Substances in the non-ionic form are glucose, amino acids, and urea. Now let's go through the two types of active transport. Primary active transport is the type of transport mechanism in which the energy is liberated directly from the breakdown of ATP. The substances like sodium, potassium, calcium, hydrogen, and chloride are transported across the cell membrane. As for the secondary active transport, secondary active transport is the transport of a substance with a sodium ion by means of a common carrier protein. When sodium is transported by a carrier protein, another substance is also transported by the same protein simultaneously, either in the same direction or in the opposite direction. Thus, the transport of sodium is coupled with the transport of another substance. Let's look at the transport of sodium and potassium ions to understand the primary active transport mechanism more easily. Sodium and potassium ions are transported across the cell membrane by means of a common carrier protein called sodium-potassium pump. This pump transports sodium from inside to outside the cell and potassium from outside to inside the cell. This pump is present in all the cells of the body. This pump is mainly responsible for the development of resting membrane potential due to the distribution of sodium and potassium across the cell membrane. As we previously saw, it is an example of antiport. Structurally, the pump constitutes the carrier protein subunits, namely the alpha and beta subunits. Transport of sodium and potassium occurs only by alpha subunit. The beta subunit is a glycoprotein, the function of which is not clear. Alpha subunit of the sodium-potassium pump has got 6 sites. 3 receptor sites for sodium ions on the inner surface of the protein molecule. 2 receptor sites for potassium ions on the outer, towards ECF, surface of the protein molecule. 1 site for enzyme adenosine triphosphate, or at PACE, which is near the sites for sodium. The mechanism of action of sodium-potassium pump. 3 sodium ions from the cell get attached to the receptor sites of sodium ions on the inner surface of the carrier protein. 2 potassium ions outside the cell bind to the receptor sites of potassium ions located on the outer surface of the carrier protein. Binding of sodium and potassium ions to carrier protein activates the enzyme ATPase. ATPase causes the breakdown of ATP into adenosine diphosphate with the release of 1 high-energy phosphate. Sodium-potassium pump moves 3 sodium ions outside the cell and 2 potassium ions inside the cell. As for the secondary active transport, it also has 2 types. Let's talk about sodium cotransport first. Sodium cotransport is the process in which, along with sodium, another substance is transported by a carrier protein. This carrier protein is known as symport. Energy for the movement of sodium is obtained by the breakdown of ATP, and the newly released energy is utilized for the movement of another substance, such as chlorine, glucose, and amino acids. Another mechanism that falls under the category of secondary active transport is sodium countertransport. Sodium countertransport is the process by which the substances are transported across the cell membrane in exchange for sodium ions by carrier protein called antiport. Various countertransport systems are sodium-hydrogen countertransport. In this system, the hydrogen ions are exchanged for sodium ions, and this occurs in the renal tubular cells. Sodium-calcium countertransport, in opposite directions with the help of a carrier protein. This type of transport of sodium and calcium ions is present in all the cells. That is all about the membrane transport mechanisms of a cell. Stay tuned to watch more physiology-related videos.